Well, hello. That was my dad, Edward Lefferts Thorne. He was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada on Friday, June 13th, 1913. And in some ways, he led a very unlucky life. In others, it was a rewarding, enriching, and giving life of 90 years. Lefferts is a Dutch name. My family were shippers out of Bristol, England, and Robert Thorne brought some Dutch to New Amsterdam, New York, in 1638. And he married into one of those Dutch families. Their name was Lefferts, and many of the firstborn sons in the Thorne family of New York were named Edward Lefferts. My dad's dad, his dad's. I don't know how many before that, my brother and his son. I'm the youngest, I'm Stephen. Anyway, some of my dad's earliest memories were of the First World War. He was a great storyteller, and I wish I'd recorded him. He used to tell us about the Halifax explosion, which occurred in December 1917. He was 4 years old, 4.5. And he has clear memories of that day, when two ships, the Emo and the Mont Blanc, collided, and one of them, a munitions ship, caught fire and exploded. It flattened a good portion of the city and killed a couple of thousand people and injured and blinded many, many, many more. And my dad remembers walking with thousands of people filing down Barrington Street, which is one of the main drags in the city. It goes the length of the city parallel to the harbor. And everybody headed to the park, and I think it was snowing. It was December, and he remembers a house that they passed with a big crack in the bricks on the side. And later in life, when he used to take us for drives on Sunday evenings after supper in the summer, he'd point out that crack, which had been obviously repaired, tell us that that happened in the Halifax explosion. And I doubt there's many people who even know that crack's there, much less why. And he knew the city of Halifax like the back of his hand. He spent pretty much his whole life there. And during these drives, he'd take us to every little nook and cranny. And he had a story about every one. And there was another house in South End Halifax that had been built by an Englishman who had moved over and left his family behind, and when the house was ready, he sent for them, and they all died on the Titanic. It was interesting going for drives with my dad. He called them toots. And to this day, I love to go for toots with the people that I love. His mother was a wartime nurse at Camp Hill Veterans Hospital in Halifax. It was a hospital for the war wounded. And she caught tuberculosis. And my dad caught tuberculosis from her and his brother. And the three of them were shipped off to a sanatorium in Saranac Lake, New York, which was famous for its treatment of tuberculosis. And treatment at that time really consisted of a lot of fresh air and hope. Well, hope eventually ran out for his mom. She died. Her name was Catherine, and we named our daughter after her. Catherine Louise. Louise for her maternal grandmother. And his brother died too, just 2 years old. My dad survived, and he had lung issues the rest of his life, and nevertheless, despite the fact that he was a doctor, he smoked cigarettes and pipes, and only quit late in life, when it really probably didn't make much difference. He remembers the stock market crash in 1929, and he was certainly a child of the Depression. He conserved and recycled everything he possibly could. He made everything, including his cars, go as long as possible. He did all his own maintenance and oil changes and tire changes and rotations. And his cars were immaculately cared for. He loved his cars. And he had drawers full of corks and drawers full of string and elastic bands, and he couldn't throw anything away. And long before it was in vogue to do so, he recycled as much as possible. Tied his newspapers up in neat stacks, took his bottles and plastic bottles and tin cans to a recycling depot in Halifax, long before green bins or any of that kind of stuff. He was before his time as a doctor as well. He studied medicine, I think largely because of his experience as a child. And he got married in the 1930s to a woman that I suspect was probably the love of his life. One night she got a headache and he went to get her a aspirin and came back and she was dead from a brain hemorrhage. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force after the war began, and he met my mom, who was in naval intelligence in Cape Breton. She worked in one of those rooms where you had a long stick and you moved toy ships around a big flat table with a map on it. They were convoys in the North Atlantic. They had a whirlwind romance and they got married, and within a few weeks or months my dad shipped off to England for 3 years. He was in a couple of fighter squadrons, 401 and 416, and later in Bomber Command. He had incredible stories. He didn't talk much about it until later in life, but he certainly came back a different man than when he left. He had one story I remember about a kid that came in on the ship, from the ships, one of those convoys, no doubt, green, fresh off the boat, and he was put in the tail end of a B-17 bomber the next morning. And he made it back, ankle deep in shell casings, white as a ghost, and his fists locked on that machine gun. They had to literally pry his hands off one finger at a time. Yeah. So when he came back, he and my mom went out to Alberta for a year's internship where he could update and upgrade his skills in Calgary. My brother was born there. They returned to Halifax, and he set up shop on Gottingen Street, north end of Halifax, an area of the city that some might call a combat zone. And he had one colorful collection of patients. His practice started well before Medicare came on the scene, so a lot of his payments were in barter, in goods and services, for services rendered. So we often had people coming around the house to do odd jobs and stuff, or my mother would pluck chickens. And he had one patient who was a lobster fisherman, and twice a year he'd go collect his payment in lobster for services rendered. That was before I loved lobster, unfortunately. He loved his cars, he loved his family, but his life was his work. And he delivered babies in Africville and tar paper shacks in the middle of winter with the wind blowing through. He had wonderful stories, and as I say, I wish I'd recorded them. He could have written a book, or I could have. His office phone rang at home. He was on call 24/7, 365 days a year. And my, what a bunch of patients he had. Wonderful Christmas gifts they'd give him, some pretty funny stuff. And he had one family, 2 sisters and a brother, I think, that all lived together. They were older, and they used to bring him birthday cakes every June 15th, or 13th, I'm sorry. June 15th is my son's birthday, and we used to celebrate them together when we lived in Halifax in the 90s. He retired at 87 years old. I think he probably was doing house calls until the day he stepped off the treadmill. And He outlived most of his patients. There weren't too many left by the time he quit. And it was all downhill from there. I didn't think that he'd last too long after he retired, and he didn't. He died in September 2003, and I was in Afghanistan at the time, and I wrote his obit and sent his eulogy for my brother to read at the funeral. But we all remember him with great fondness, and he was a colorful, eccentric man who was extremely intelligent and extremely generous and a real humanitarian. And I see elements of him in my own kids. So that's my dad, Edward Lefferts Thorne, Doc Ted, 90 years old. Great guy. Happy Father's Day, everybody.